Thanks, Angus. Well, it's going to be a very tough Christmas for a lot of Australian families, and that's because this is a government that clearly has the wrong priorities. This has been a high-tax, high-spend budget, and that's been confirmed in my EFO today. As Angus mentioned, $379 billion more in taxes and $209 billion more in spending since this government came to power, and nothing has been done to reduce inflation by pulling the fiscal levers at this government's disposal. In fact, my EFO confirmed today that inflation is going to remain higher for longer. Let's be very, very clear. The government is asking you to pat them on the back for not spending money, not spending revenue that they weren't expecting and that there was no policy to create. They're telling you that they have saved and reprioritised. Well, a saving is not a saving if you're spending it on something else. Reprioritisations is simply a fancy way of saying we've spent the money on something else. And those reprioritisations have already been announced as part of Catherine King's infrastructure cuts. Quite frankly, if you are reprioritising taxpayer money towards infrastructure that hasn't had the productivity lens put over it on something like the suburban rail loop, which, as we know, is a boondoggle investment that could go well out of control, that the Victorian government has now committed Victorian taxpayers to, and all taxpayers around the country, with the $2.2 billion that has been committed by this government. If that is considered productive infrastructure investment, well, I've got some swamplands that I'd like to sell you to. Savings are not savings if you spend them elsewhere. The NDIS was the biggest saving identified in the budget back in May, taking it from a 14% growth in expenditure to 8%, and yet there was not a single policy that backed up what was essentially a spending cap. In this MyEFO, we know from National Cabinet meetings that there is going to be additional money spent to the states, given to the states, to compensate them for the NDIS spending cap. And yet in this MyEFO, we've seen that shoved into measures that we can't yet announce. Now, that's a nonsense. That's hiding the increased expenditure of this government. That NDIS is not a saving. It's not a saving. It's still out of control. Australians are facing a really tough Christmas. They're going to have to make some big decisions about their own family budgets. It's a real shame that this Labor government has failed to make decisions, those tough decisions around theirs.
Senator King, you talked about pulling the fiscal levers to fight inflation, but Angus said that the MyEFO had ignored the household budget. So which is it? Should it be more giveaways or saving more?
Well, that's entirely consistent. You know that you can pull the fiscal levers in order to manage inflation. In fact, what this government has said, and I think Jim Chalmers said it just yesterday, was that fiscal policy and monetary policy are in lockstep. Well, that's nonsense. That's absolute nonsense. Monetary policy is clearly contractionary, but if you've got a high tax and high spend budget, that's not contractionary. That's quite the opposite. Now, they can say whatever it is that they want, but you don't have to look too far into these numbers to realise that this is a government who cannot contain that urge to spend that seems to be innate in Labor. You know, fiscal discipline shouldn't be a catch cry. It should be part of your DNA. It's something that this government's failed to do.
Can I add to that? If you look at the policy variations in this statement, the spends are 5 times more than the saves. I mean, and this happens time and time again. You see the Treasurer doing some strange arithmetic, but the truth is, every time when it comes to the crunch, this government always wants to spend more than it saves. So that's the reality. Now, if you want to beat inflation, we know from history, it's very clear. You've got to pull every lever at your disposal. Fiscal policy is important, and spending in particular is important. You don't tax your way out of a cost of living crisis. That's not what we've done in the past, and it won't achieve it in the future. Get to the source of the problem. Don't deal with the symptoms. And this is a government that's failing to get to the source of the problem, and Australians are paying a high price.
Mr. Taylor, the upgrades that we saw in the inflation forecasts, the government says are related to That's where we'll leave the opposition, responding there to the mid-year budget update that was revealed by the Treasurer Jim Chalmers a little bit earlier. As you've heard there, the opposition continuing on the theme it's really been pursuing all year now, blaming the government for the cost of living pressures facing Australians.